people of the world are living in conditions approaching misery. Their poverty is a handicap and a threat both to them and to more prosperous areas. For the first time in history, humanity possesses the knowledge and skill to relieve the suffering of these people.
A new chapter in the history of poverty is beginning. The world is now divided into rich countries and poor countries. The rich countries at long last admit they have to help the poor ones. You are shown to a seat at a big table. A black man, surrounded by white businessmen. They all address you as Mr. President. They want to help you build factories in your young country, which they say will make your people rich. One man says, first, you have to build the biggest dam in the world. Then another says, we will help you by lending you millions of dollars. All you have to do is promise to pay it back at a huge rate of interest. Soldiers have come into your offices and they are forcing you to flee. There are ever greater contrasts. Slums spreading outwards and skyscrapers zooming upwards. Refugees fleeing across bridges and highways packed with new cars. Oceans full of container ships, camps full of starving families. You go down to take a closer look. You are appearing in a TV game show. It's called Who Wants to Be a Billionaire?
Who wants to be a billionaire?
The host chats to the first competitor.
You're a lady from Bangladesh.
She's a lady from Bangladesh who borrowed money from a microfinance bank at low rates of interest, which she used to invest in her street stall. And now, she runs a supermarket. Lula, the ex-president of Brazil. He was born into poverty, and he had some ideas about how to help others out of it. Then the host chats to you, the contestant from China. Your name is Dong Qinghao. You were a poor farm laborer who went to the city and started selling ice lollies. And in 20 years, you built that up into China's largest drinks company with a drink called Future Cola.
Future Cola. And now, the question for you on which the billion-dollar prize rests. What reduces poverty today? Is it A, B, communism, C, state spending, or D, globalization?
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt, they will work in the seclusion of this White Mountains resort.
Along with the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank was set up at the Bretton Woods Conference in America in 1944. The bank's aim was to finance the reconstruction of Europe, then to develop the Third World. It was decided the headquarters would be in Washington, and the president would come from the country with the largest shareholding.
Summing up the importance of Bretton Woods, Mr. Vinson says,
ours is a mission of peace, designed to establish the economic foundations of peace on the bedrock of genuine international cooperation.
What this idealism really meant was spelt out in the charter they were signing: to promote private foreign investment by means of guarantees or loans made by private investors.
The outstanding feature of the 20th century has been the enormous expansion in the numbers who are given the opportunity to share in the larger and more varied life, which in previous periods was reserved for the few and for the very few. If, with all resources of modern science, we find ourselves unable to avert world famine, we shall all be to blame. But a peculiar responsibility would rest upon the scientists. I do not believe that they will fail. But if they do, or perhaps were not allowed to succeed, the consequences would be very unpleasant.
But if a man doesn't have a job or an income, he has neither life nor liberty, possibility for the pursuit of happiness.
If a free society cannot help the many who are poor, it cannot save the few who are rich.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty. And the real question is whether we have the will.
The World Bank has always been deceptive about its role in the international economy. It attempts to portray itself as an institution looking out for the interest of not only poor countries, but for poor people within those countries. That has never been the case. The bank is pushing the interest or promoting the interest of countries in the first world and for an elite sector in the third world.
The World Bank and the IMF began offering loans to poor countries, but only if they privatized their economies and allowed Western corporations free access to their raw materials and markets.
The bank presents itself as an economic development agency focused on the reduction of poverty. But in fact, the bank operated during the entire Cold War as an institution that distributed resources to mostly authoritarian regimes in the third world that supported the West in the Cold War. They had plenty of projects, some of which surely were valuable, many of which were not. Every one of these projects, from the government officials' point of view, was an opportunity to skim, to live a luxurious life.
The World Bank says its aim is to help poor people, promoting what it calls global development. It's an ingenious system, a kind of socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. The rich get richer on running up debt, cheap labor, and paying as little tax as possible, while the poor get poorer as their jobs and public services are cut back in order to pay just the interest on debt owed by their governments to the World Bank. In 1998, short-term capital was suddenly pulled out of Asia, crippling the miracle economy overnight.
When the Indonesian rupiah collapsed from being roughly 2,500 rupiah to the dollar to being what it is now, 10,000 rupiah to the dollar, the costs to Nike for each Indonesian laborer was cut to 25% of what it had been. And Nike got a great discount on Indonesian labor as a result.
I went to Washington to interview the chief economist of the World Bank, Nicholas Stern. I asked him to explain how almost 30% of World Bank loans to Indonesia had been lost or stolen.
We simply don't know what that number is.
Here's your own internal report, August 97. I quote, "We estimate that at least 20 to 30% of Government of Indonesia development budget funds are diverted through informal payments to government staff and politicians."
That number was plucked out of the air. Lots of times we have to guess with numbers, and the person who wrote that was guessing. Somebody comes up with a number and it gets recycled. But
a lot of money.
I don't want to dismiss the issue. Just let's not get hung up on one figure, which isn't a particularly hard
no,
figure.
but I mean, if it's a third of what the World Bank has put into one country...
No, then it's a serious question. When you have a loan, there's a lender and a borrower, and they share the responsibility in some way. We got a number of things wrong, and we have to understand that. We're going to get things wrong again. Not so many people called the Asian crisis before it happened. We failed along with
That's your job, though, isn't it? You're all economists with fantastic degrees and brilliant backgrounds, and
And how can you get it that wrong?
We're going to get it wrong some of the time. I think non-economists get it wrong a lot more often than economists. But this isn't a precise game, and there are going to be a number of occasions in the future where we get things wrong too.
Debt has really been used as an instrument in order for the IMF and the World Bank to get their policies implemented in many developing countries.
Part of the design of structural adjustment programs, that's what these policies are called, is to drive down real wages.
Unseen by shoppers in the high street, the famous brands of almost everything from running shoes to baby clothes are now made in very poor countries with cheap labor. The world's oldest human rights organization, the Anti-Slavery Society, has declared debt a contemporary form of slavery. Nowhere is this more vividly demonstrated than in the Philippines, where 44% of the national budget is given to paying interest charges to foreign banks, compared with just 3% for health services. Moreover, billions of dollars continue to leave this country just to meet the interest on money borrowed by the dictator Ferdinand Marcos in deals that were often secret and fraudulent. There is perhaps no greater example of the burden of debt than one notorious project in the Philippines. In 1974, the American company General Electric applied to build the Bataan nuclear power station. Marcos accepted the highest bidder, the Westinghouse company. Moreover, the deal would be underwritten by the American government through the Export-Import Bank and a clutch of private American banks. Built less than 60 miles from the city of Manila on 3 earthquake faults near 2 live volcanoes, one of which recently erupted, this is the Bataan nuclear power station. By 1977, President Carter had stopped the building of nuclear power plants because of their inefficiency and faulty design. But he did nothing to stop the same plants being built in third world countries like the Philippines. Moreover, the State Department, which had to approve Westinghouse's export license, knew the Bataan power station was to be built in an earthquake zone, but still it was encouraged to go ahead.
Casey goes to Manila. Casey comes back, recommends that the U.S. government, through this Export-Import Bank, give an initial loan. That opens the gate for all these other banks to come in and give loans, and they start building. Westinghouse at this time does the usual thing. You have delays, you have problems. The price goes up and up and up. First to 1.1 billion, finally to 2.2 billion. Some estimate that the final cost to the Philippines will be $2.6 billion. So you have a $2.6 billion fiasco that will never produce 1 watt of electricity, which now the Filipino people have to repay.
When Marcos was overthrown in 1986, Gloria Aquino was swept to power. Her promise to the Filipino people was that they would be the beneficiaries of their civilized uprising against Marcos. "I will vigorously renegotiate," she said, "the terms of our foreign debt." But in the end, she gave priority to paying off the banks. President Aquino declared the Bataan power station unsafe, and it was closed forever. At the same time, her government began legal action in the United States against Westinghouse. The American judge found ample evidence of bribery. On the day before the case was due to be heard in March, it was settled out of court. Westinghouse agreed to pay the Philippines $100 million. But remarkably, the Aquino government agreed to give Westinghouse $400 million just to make the power station work, regardless of its position in an earthquake zone. And this $400 million will be borrowed from the same American Export-Import Bank and will have to be repaid by the Filipino people, most of whom live in poverty. As the debt is paid back at a rate of more than $6 million a day, the rich, like the elites in all debtor nations, increasingly rely on private armies to protect their shopping malls, their homes and their interests. According to Amnesty International, political killings carried out by the government and government-backed forces in violation of the law have become the most serious human rights problem in the Philippines. This is a country abundant in food, but food does not pay back the debt or encourage foreign investors, and so agriculture and a whole way of life is being structurally adjusted. This is the Calabazon Super Project, turning food-growing land into factories for export production. Funded largely by Japan, it is the kind of so-called reform demanded by the IMF. The new factories will produce new revenue and profits for foreigners. They will also produce new debt for the Philippines. Hardly a tree left standing. Forests as big as Denmark have been wiped out, bringing to an end one of the richest ecosystems on the planet, the home of thousands of species of plants and animals.
The environment is probably the major victim next to human beings of the debt crisis, if only because countries are obliged to cash in their resources. They must cut down their forests. They must dig up their minerals and ruin their land, producing cash crops so that they can earn enough hard currency to keep on paying the debt. There is an almost perfect correlation between the top debtors and the top deforesters. It's a striking correlation.
In the Amazon area of Brazil, in Ghana, in Costa Rica, roads are built, incentives are given to allow the extraction of these resources. Particularly now with structural adjustment, there is a program in place in most countries of deregulation, that is deregulating control of these industries. And also, there is not enough money in the budget to oversee these activities. So you're seeing the wholesale raping of these environments.
At their 1991 conference, the World Bank and IMF appeared to be making a special commitment to the environment. What would your response be to that?
If the World Bank is now saying how green it is, what it's not saying is how much it has destroyed through its policies. It's not enough to put a green tail on a very large, monstrous dog, which is destroying the environment, and that is what debt is doing.
At least 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 per day. To put things into perspective, the top 20% of the world's population accounts for 3/4 of the world's income. Half of the world's population accounts for only 5% of the world's income. According to UNICEF, 22,000 children die every day due to poverty. Nearly 1/3 of children in developing countries are estimated to be underweight or stunted. Last year, about 70 million children of primary school age were not in school. Nearly 1 billion people celebrated the coming of the 21st century without being able to read a book or sign their name. Preventable diseases like malaria afflict nearly 500 million people every year. Africa alone accounts for roughly 1 million deaths due to malaria annually. Most of them are children. Speaking of children, there are 2.2 billion children in the world. Half of them live in extreme poverty. Over 1 billion people have inadequate access to water, and 2.6 billion lack basic sanitation. Many times this means there's no separation of drinking water and toilet water. That's why 1.8 million children die every year of diarrhea. Approximately half of the world's population now lives in cities, and about 1/3 of those in the cities live in slum conditions. In fact, slum growth is outpacing urban growth by a frighteningly large margin. 1/4 of humanity lives without electricity. The 7 richest people in the world make more than the poorest 41 countries combined. That's roughly 567 million people. 0.14% of the world's population owns over 80% of the world's private financial wealth. The vast majority of that wealth has managed to avoid all income and estate taxes, either by the countries where it's been invested or where it comes from. For every $1 in aid that a developing country receives, over $25 is spent on debt repayment. In 1998, $8 billion was spent on cosmetics in the United States. $11 billion was spent on ice cream in the European Union. $17 billion was spent on pet food in Europe and the US. $100 billion was spent on alcohol in Europe. $400 billion was spent on narcotics globally. And $780 billion was spent on militaries around the world. In the same year, $6 billion was spent on achieving basic education for all. $9 billion was spent on basic water and sanitation. And $13 billion was spent on basic health and nutrition for all. With new technologies, we now grow enough food to feed 10 billion people. The problem is that most of the world can't afford to buy that food. If the world spent less than 1% of what it spends on weapons, all the previously mentioned issues would be fixed.
Surely never before has the human race enjoyed such amazing capacity to create wealth and reduce poverty. Yet never before has the gulf between rich and poor been so vast and inequality so widespread.
What is taking place today is the greatest transfer of public wealth to private hands in the history of this earth.
And we're into a situation now where the poorest countries are in a cycle, a vicious cycle of poverty. They can't get out. And the kind of debt cancellation that's been given still will not allow them to get out of this poverty trap.
The citizens who bear the burden of this debt never got the money. Why should it still sit on their shoulders to be repaid?
It's not a question of debt forgiveness, because actually many of the debts were incurred under pressure from the international institutions or were given in collusion with governments which weren't acting in the interests of their people.
Remember Live Aid in 1985, that symbol of concern and generosity? Did you know that during that year, the hungriest countries in Africa gave twice as much money to us in the developed world as we gave to them? Perhaps you were one of those who took part in Red Nose Day. Did you know that before that day was over, the equivalent of all the money that Comic Relief had raised in Britain had come back to the rich countries? For every day this amount is given by the poorest to the rich as interest payments on loans that most of them never asked for or knew existed. In other words, contrary to a myth long popular in the West, it's been the poor of the world who've financed the rich, not the other way round. Given that most countries do have enough resources to provide for their people, why should they have to tolerate a system that forces parents to watch their children die slowly? Indeed, why should the burden of debt fall to those least responsible for it? Above all, why should the lives of ordinary people be controlled by a few who are themselves unaccountable and whose decisions and judgments are dictated by a belief that economics is meant not to serve people, but as some kind of holy writ requiring regular offerings, even blood sacrifices, to a god called the bottom line?
The facts of globalization are revealing.
Well, there they are. Our new electronic media, or our new gadgets. You push a button and the world's yours. You know how they talk about the world getting smaller? Well, it's thanks to these that it is. Everywhere is now our own neighborhood. We know what it's like to go on safari in Kenya, or to have an audience with the Pope, to order a cognac in a Paris cafe. But not only is the world getting smaller, it's becoming more available and more familiar to our minds and to our emotions. The world is now a global village. A global village.
As we set out through the dense jungle, we had but one goal in mind: to bring the people sustainable development. However, in this case, we did encounter an unexpected challenge. We discovered that these people, in their own peculiar kind of way, were already sustainable. So all we could really bring them was development. We started by taking them through the process of participatory community project building, but they refused to fully participate. Next, we tried income-generating activities, but for some strange reason, they seemed satisfied with less than $1 a day. We even tried empowering them, but their reaction was much more powerful than we expected. But we weren't going to give up on these people so easily. We knew they needed our help, even if they weren't aware of it. So we opted for the multi-stakeholder cross-disciplinary approach. We developed innovative private sector partnerships. Then we taught the people vocational skills that were adapted to a shifting economy. We created tough conservation measures to protect the environment from further harm. And we developed ambitious social safety nets to protect those unable to care for themselves. I'd say it's been a challenging process. We've learned many important lessons, and we really look forward to applying them elsewhere in the future. But for now, let us just say, welcome to the global village.
Is this the global village we are told is our future? Or is it merely an old project that used to be run by the divine right of kings and is now run by the divine right of multinational corporations and by the financial institutions and governments that back them? A small group of powerful individuals are now richer than most of the population of Africa. Just 200 giant corporations dominate a quarter of the world's economic activity.
Let me ask you, do you know the difference between Tanzania and Goldman Sachs? Tanzania is a country that has a gross national product of $2.2 billion and shares it between 25 million people. Goldman Sachs is an investment firm which has annual profits of $2.2 billion and shares them among 161 partners. That's the world we're living in now.
Transnational corporations have a long and dark history of condoning tyrannical governments. Is it narcissism that compels them to seek their reflection in the regimented structures of fascist regimes? It should not surprise us that corporate allegiance to profits will trump their allegiance to any flag. A recent U.S. Treasury Department report revealed that in 1 week alone, 57 U.S. corporations were fined for trading with official enemies of the United States, including terrorists, tyrants, and despotic regimes.
You can roughly locate any community somewhere along a scale running all the way from democracy to despotism. This man makes it his job to study these things.
Well, for one thing, avoid the comfortable idea that the mere form of government can of itself safeguard a nation against despotism.
For big business, despotism was often a useful tool for securing foreign markets and pursuing profits. One of the U.S. Marine Corps' most highly decorated generals, Smedley Darlington Butler, by his own account, helped pacify Mexico for American oil companies, Haiti and Cuba for National City Bank, Nicaragua for the Brown Brothers Brokerage, the Dominican Republic for sugar interests, Honduras for U.S. fruit companies, and China for Standard Oil. General Butler's services were also in demand in the United States itself in the 1930s, as President Franklin Delano Roosevelt sought to relieve the misery of the Depression through public enterprise and tougher regulations on corporate exploitation and misdeeds.
More power to you, President Roosevelt. The entire country's behind you, thrilled with hope and patriotism.
But the country was not entirely behind the populist president. Large parts of the corporate elite despised what Roosevelt's New Deal stood for. And so, in 1934, a group of conspirators sought to involve General Butler in a treasonous plan.
The plan as outlined to me was to form an organization of veterans, to use as a bluff or as a club at least, to intimidate the government.
But the corporate cabal had picked the wrong man. Butler was fed up with being what he called a gangster for capitalism.
I appeared before the Congressional Committee, the highest representation of the American people, under subpoena to tell what I knew of activities which I believe might lead to an attempt to set up a fascist dictatorship. The upshot of the whole thing was that I was supposed to lead an organization of 500,000 men, which would be able to take over the functions of government.
A congressional committee ultimately found evidence of a plot to overthrow Roosevelt. According to Butler, the conspiracy included representatives of some of America's top corporations, including J.P. Morgan, DuPont, and Goodyear Tire. As today's chairman of Goodyear Tire knows, for corporations to dominate government, a coup, is no longer necessary.
Corporations have gone global. And by going global, the governments have lost some control over corporations. Regardless of whether the corporation can be trusted or cannot be trusted, governments today do not have over the corporations the power that they had and the leverage that they had 50 or 60 years ago. And that's a major change. So governments have become powerless compared to where they were before.
Globalization began in Britain in the 1980s when Margaret Thatcher dismantled much of manufacturing and poured millions of pounds into building up the arms industry. The disastrous selling off of the railways and the creeping privatization of everything from healthcare to air traffic control. The financial pages celebrate a booming economy. Yet 1 in 5 British children grows up in poverty. There are almost 10 million Britons living in poverty. The gap between the rich and the rest gets wider, and this is said to be a spurious cause. All over the world, millions of ordinary people are asking why they have no say in decisions that bring hardship to their lives. They don't accept the view that there's no other way. Why, people ask, should we accept a system of winners and losers, a system that puts a dollar sign on every public service and almost every human value? Why should we accept this? Why should our children have to face these divisions and dangers? None of them is God-given. All of them can be changed. Why not abolish the World Bank and the IMF and the World Trade Organization and replace them with genuine trade and development institutions that are democratically accountable?
They will tell us that we need them, and that what they do is too complicated for us to understand. They will tell us it won't happen again. They will spend billions fighting reform. It won't be easy. But some things are worth fighting for.
The 3 most important needs of every human being on earth are not food, clothing, and shelter as much as the need for freedom, justice, and healing.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth and boldly. Primarily, this is because the rulers of the exchange of mankind's goods have failed through their own stubbornness and their own incompetence, have admitted their failure and have abdicated. Practices of the unscrupulous money changers stand indicted in the court of public opinion, rejected by the hearts and minds of men.
In 1932, in the aftermath of America's great stock market crash, a piece of legislation was passed to protect society. The Glass-Steagall Act was introduced to separate ordinary high street banking from investment banking. 67 years later, in 1999, under the influence of Treasury Secretary Larry Summers and his predecessor Robert Rubin, President Bill Clinton repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. Once again, banks could take ordinary depositors' money and speculate with it on virtually anything they liked.
We now stand 10 years past the midpoint of a century that has witnessed 4 major wars among great nations, a huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture, a dramatic expansion in basic and applied research. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance in and among national programs. Balance between the private and the public economy, balance between the cost and hoped-for advantages, balance between the clearly necessary and the comfortably desirable, balance between our essential requirements as a nation and the duties imposed by the nation upon the individual, balance between actions of the moment and the national welfare of the future. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings. Those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility, that all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth, and that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love.
I think our most powerful weapon is education. It's not a surprise that it's come up in so many different forms, because if people knew what was happening, they wouldn't accept what was happening. So education is the core of it, and the reason why pressure on education is the government doesn't really want the public to know, because if they did know and understand what was going on, there would be big changes. I'm old now, and the older I get, the more I realise every single generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again. There's no final victory and there's no final defeat, and therefore a little bit of history may help. I mean, the simple lesson, I won't go back to basics, but I mean, the truth is that this country and the world have been run by rich and powerful men from the beginning of time. Began with slavery, they owned the workers and the land. If any slave objected, he was flogged or hanged, and that kept them in order. And the only real wealth in the world is land and the resources that lie under it and the people. They are the real source of wealth. And until really quite recently, working people had no rights at all. In 1834, which is only about 90 years before I was born, only 2% of the population had the vote. They were all rich men. Women didn't have the vote at all. And out of trade unionism came the change. The Chartists, votes for men, the suffragettes, for votes for women, trade union movement wanted representation in Parliament, Labour Party was formed, adopted a socialist programme, and that was the first real change. And of course, when the slump occurred in the 1930s, it produced, and I'm so glad the campaign against the BNP has been mentioned, of course, it was Hitler used the Jews and the communists as an excuse to get into power, and he said to them, give me votes, give me power, said Hitler, I'll give you jobs. He did give them jobs. Put half of the unemployed in the army, other half in the factories, and there was another war, and we lost 105 million people in 2 world wars from 1914 to 1940. 105 million people died, and that was the price of capitalism and imperial competition. And you see, when you come to the Thatcher period, this is what's so interesting. Thatcher was a much cleverer woman than we give her credit for. She knew perfectly well the strength of the labour movement lay in 3 sources of power. One was the trade union movement, so she took on the miners and she introduced legislation that made trade unionism actually illegal. Which is still there. You can't be a proper trade unionist now because your rights are taken away. So what she said, and this is very clever, she said, well, you can buy a council house, so you'll be a property owner. You may not be able to get a wage increase, but you can borrow. And the borrowing was deliberately encouraged because people in debt are slaves to their employers. That's how the whole thing began. And that's why borrowing was a deliberate policy to make the working class today slaves again. And that's exactly what they are. I mean, many trade unions don't go on strike because they're afraid they lose their job and lose their home, and so that's what the policy was. She also attacked local government, and she attacked the public sector and privatised it. And this privatisation is internationally. I met an old friend of mine called Kenneth Kaunda, who was the president of Zambia. I met him when he came out of a British prison years ago, before he was president, and he said, we had a great debt, and the IMF came along, and he said, I'll lift your debt if you'll sell off all your schools and hospitals. to multinational corporations. So privatization is a deliberate policy, along with the destruction of local democracy and the destruction of the trade union, to restore power back to where it was. And what we are now back in, that's what the whole crisis is about, the restoration of power of those who've always controlled the world, the people who've owned the land and the resources and all the rest of it. And that is something we need to understand. And just get it. When I hear the government say we want to restore confidence in the banking system, well, I must say I don't want to restore such confidence in the banking system. They do it all over again. Because this theory that wealth trickles down, actually, wealth bubbles up to the people at the very top. And I mean, look at these obscene bonuses they're getting, and then perpetual squeezing down the line. It's very important to keep optimism. I think progress has been made by two flames that have always been burning in the human heart. The flame of anger against injustice and the flame of hope you can build a better world. Keep those two flames burning.
That I know that justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is the threat to justice everywhere.
Can you say why America is the greatest country in the world?
Diversity and opportunity.
Lewis? Freedom and freedom. So let's keep it that way.
Well, why is America
not the greatest country in the world, Professor? That's my answer.
You're saying...
Yes.
Let's talk about...
Fine.
Sharon, the NEA is a loser. Yeah, it accounts for a penny out of our paycheck, but he gets to hit you with it anytime he wants. It doesn't cost money. It costs votes. It costs airtime and column inches. You know why people don't like liberals? Because they lose.
If liberals are so fucking smart, how come they lose so goddamn always?
Hey, and with a straight face, you're going to tell students that America is so star-spangled awesome that we're the only ones in the world who have freedom?
Canada has freedom. Japan has freedom. The UK, France, Italy, Germany, Spain,
Australia, Belgium has freedom. So 207 sovereign states in the world, like 180 of them have freedom.
All right.
And yet you, sorority girl,
just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day,
there's some things you should know. And one of them is, there is absolutely no evidence to support the statement that we're the greatest country in the world. We're 7th in literacy, 27th in math, 22nd in science, 49th in life expectancy, 178th in infant mortality, 3rd in median household income, number 4 in labor force, and number 4 in exports. We lead the world in only 3 categories: number of incarcerated citizens per capita, number of adults who believe angels are real, and defense spending, where we spend more than the next 26 countries combined, 25 of whom are allies. Now, none of this is the fault of a 20-year-old college student, but you nonetheless are, without a doubt, a member of the worst generation ever. So when you ask what makes us the greatest country in the world, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Yosemite?
Sure used to be. We stood up for what was right. We fought for moral reasons. We passed laws, struck down laws for moral reasons. We waged wars on poverty, not poor people. We sacrificed. We cared about our neighbors. We put our money where our mouths were, and we never beat our chest. We built great big things, made ungodly technological advances, explored the universe, cured diseases, and we cultivated the world's greatest artists and the world's greatest economy. We reached for the stars, acted like men. We aspired to intelligence. We didn't belittle it. It didn't make us feel inferior. We didn't identify ourselves by who we voted for in the last election, and we didn't scare so easy. We were able to be all these things and do all these things because we were informed by great men, men who were revered. First step in solving any problem is recognizing there is one. America is not the greatest country in the world anymore.
Capitalism today commands the towering heights and has displaced politics and politicians as the new high priests and reigning oligarchs of our system. So capitalism and its principal protagonists and players, corporate CEOs, have been accorded unusual power and access. This is not to deny the significance of government and politicians, but these are the new high priests.
We inhabit a system of inverted totalitarianism, the political coming of age of corporate power and the political demobilization of the citizen. Inverted totalitarianism differs from classical forms of totalitarianism, which revolve around a demagogue or charismatic leader. It finds its expression in the anonymity of the corporate state. The corporate forces behind inverted totalitarianism do not replace decaying structures with new revolutionary ones. They do not import new symbols or iconography as classic totalitarianism movements do. They do not offer a radical alternative. Corporate power claims to honour electoral politics, freedom and constitutions, but these corporate forces corrupt and manipulate power as to make democracy impossible. Today, the privatisation of government functions is enormous. In the United States, there are 18 military and civilian intelligence agencies, and 70% of their combined budget is outsourced to corporations. The Pentagon has privatised 69% of its workforce. The Afghanistan war effort is almost wholly privatised. Businesses now run wars and play more part in international conflicts than any state does. Corporations have 35,000 lobbyists in Washington and thousands more in state capitals that dole out corporate money to shape and write legislation. It is now a global practice, from the Politburo of China to the British Parliament. Labour leaders make lavish salaries and are considered junior partners within corporate capitalism, as long as they do not speak in the language of class struggle. Politicians, like generals, are loyal to the demands of the corporate state in power. They retire to become millionaires as lobbyists or company managers. Artists who use their talents to foster the myths and illusions that bombard our society live comfortably in the Hollywood Hills. Journalists who prize access to the powerful more than they prize the truth report lies and propaganda to propel us into wars around the world.
I mean, the real problem of the economy is not the debt and the deficit. It's the fact that the economy is so kind of grotesque that you have tens of millions of people wanting to work and not able to. You have huge financial resources. The corporations that don't know what to do with their money. Huge profits, huge bank profits. There's an enormous amount that has to be done. Just walk around any city, you can think of a million things that have to be done, and all kind, just enumerate them at will. So a huge number of idle hands, enormous resources, tremendous amount of work that has to be done, and the economy is so dysfunctional it can't put them together. That's the problem.
Lehman Brothers was forced to declare itself bankrupt.
The largest single point drop.
The regulators, they had the power to do every case that I made when I was state attorney general. They just didn't want it.
You come to us today telling us we're sorry, we didn't mean it, we won't do it again. Trust us. Well, I have some people in my constituency that actually robbed some of your banks. And they say the same thing. They're sorry, they didn't mean it, they won't do it again.
In 2009, as unemployment hit its highest level in 17 years, Morgan Stanley paid its employees over $14 billion, and Goldman Sachs paid out over $16 billion. In 2010, bonuses were even higher.
Why should a financial engineer be paid four times to 100 times more than a real engineer? A real engineer builds bridges. A financial engineer build dreams. And when those dreams turn out to be nightmares, other people pay for it.
I can't afford to. They're 4 words I live my life by. My food budget is £40 a week. That's £40 for me, my husband and our 3 children combined. It's 5 days worth of packed lunch for 3 kids and an adult, and it's dinner for 5 every night, and all of our meals at the weekend. There's a massive gap between how poverty is seen by people who don't experience it and what it really means for those of us who do. You might think people like me should watch Jamie Oliver's programme, Money Saving Meals.
I'm going to prove to you that you can all, every single one of you, eat like a king no matter what the budget.
Well, that's the same programme where he suggested a £20 shoulder of lamb to feed a family over a weekend, and that's not the reality of poverty. The reality of poverty also isn't what you see on TV. It isn't me spending all of my benefits on fags and booze while I watch telly all day in my dirty house. It's me sitting in the cold, hiding my shadow from the men at the front door as they bang their fists on the glass because I can't pay my water bill. It's calling my mum in tears because someone has sent out a bailiff, and it's counting pennies from a jar to see if there's enough to be able to buy bread. Scouring the supermarkets before they close in the hope of seeing yellow labels that might mean a meal I can afford. And it's staring at empty cupboards, hungry, ashamed, because I must have done something wrong. I must deserve it, except I don't. Until the recession hit, at the same time I had a heart attack at 29, life was good. I went from a nice house, 2 good jobs, spoiled children, to redundancy, a heart attack, a mastectomy, a bankrupt landlord, homelessness, and they all hit at the same time. Now my husband's got an admin job, I'm an author. We still work hard, but his wages, although they're above the minimum wage, don't even cover our rent. So next time you talk about poverty, make sure you know what being poor in this country really means.
A major new report has said the number of billionaires has doubled since the financial crisis. This has brought the idea of income inequality into sharp focus. So how is it that the super rich just keep getting richer? The way money circulates hasn't changed for a while. The current economic system, known as neoliberalism, is actually quite new, despite its stranglehold on the global economy. It is a distorted version of the embedded liberalism of the post-depression era, led by John Maynard Keynes. It essentially looks to regulate capitalism by lowering unemployment, raising wages, and increasing consumer demand for goods among the working middle classes to counterbalance the excesses of capitalism. Fast forward to the 70s and 80s. Despite the spiralling cost of paying for the Vietnam War and removing the gold standard backing the dollar, the rich conservatives in the US argued the stagnation of embedded liberalism was caused by too much regulation and taxation. This is the narrative that holds true for conservative thought now, with the theory being that by freeing the richest from regulation and allowing them to make more money, you get a trickle-down effect so that the wealth eventually finds its way down the different classes. This simply hasn't happened.
A common belief is that it's good for us all if a small group of people earn an enormous amount of money. The theory is that their wealth trickles down to the rest of us. But this is a myth. In reality, money is sucked up from all of us into the pockets of a very small group of people. How does this happen? One reason is the way that money is created. Right now, almost all of the money in our economy is created by banks when they make loans. Now, most people assume that when banks make loans, they're lending out someone else's savings. But they're not. Instead, when somebody takes out a loan, banks create new money electronically by typing numbers into their account. 97% of all the money in our economy is created in this way, as people take out loans from banks. The more loans people take, the more debt there is, and the more money there is. The shocking fact is, if nobody went into debt, there would be almost no money in the economy. Our economy depends on the electronic money created by banks. But because the money is created when people borrow, someone, somewhere, has to pay interest on every pound created. In effect, we are renting the money we need to run our economy from the banks. This means that in the UK alone, together we pay the banks £192 million in interest every single day. And because the debt is held mostly by the bottom 90% and wealth mostly by the top 10%, paying this interest transfers money from the bottom 90% of the population to the very top 10%. It sucks wealth and income from the rest of us up to the very lucky few. So as long as we have to rent the money we use from the banks that create it, we'll have to keep paying this huge interest bill, and the gap between the richest and the rest of us will keep increasing.
So how do the rich get richer? Well, there are many intricacies, but essentially, the entire political theory Western governments have operated on for several decades is predicated on practices that inherently result in an increased wealth gap. As that increased, as did the super-rich's influence over those governing parties, and the effect to which policies have become centred on increasing profits further. Rather than the increased wealth finding its way back into the economic system through taxation, investment in small businesses, higher wages for workers and so on, instead, they've held on to it.
There is roughly $32 trillion in offshore tax havens put there by the 1% in order to avoid supporting the society that made them rich. Most estimates say that to end global poverty forever would take $3 trillion. So we could end it 10 times over with just the amount of money hidden offshore by financial terrorists.
Have you heard this idea about the Robin Hood bankers' tax?
Yes. It's a sweet little idea, taxing the banks to help the poor, but I don't think it'll work. It's very complicated and would be very tough on the banking sector.
Which has just been given billions of pounds of taxpayers' money to keep it going.
Well, yeah, of course.
And is still paying itself billions of pounds in bonuses.
Yes.
So the tax is a charge on all bank transactions that don't include members of the public. Bonds, derivatives, currencies, speculative stuff. Is that right?
Yeah, something like that. Very complex.
So the bankers would give how much from each deal they do? 25%?
Well, no, not that much.
10%?
No.
5%?
No, not 5.
More or less?
Slightly less.
What, 1%?
Not quite.
Half of 1%?
No.
0.1%?
No.
Half of that? They give around 0.05% of every deal?
Yeah, that's about right.
And sometimes it'd be even less. That doesn't sound like a lot to most people.
No. I can see that.
And how much would it raise to help people at home and abroad?
Oh, a fair amount, I believe.
Well, £1 million a year?
No, more than that.
£100 million?
More.
£500 million?
Well,
£1 billion?
No, it's slightly more than that, I'm told.
£10 billion?
More.
£50 billion?
Yeah, that sounds about right.
In fact, I believe it's likely to be more than £100 billion. Could be double that. Could be more than double.
Yeah, possibly.
Right, so let me get this clear. A tiny tax on the banks could raise billions of pounds every year to help save lives in the poorest countries, fund crucial action against climate change around the world, and help avoid cuts to crucial public services in this country.
Gosh. Well, yeah. That is about the, some of it. I don't know. Perhaps it's, quite a good idea.
Revolutions are philosophical. Getting organized and preventing the culprits camouflaging the real problem means it's possible to embark on a bloodless revolution against the violent organizations and barbaric leaders who've trashed the economy.
The one single thing that makes me optimistic rather than cynical, pessimistic, is my students. First, I do not see the desire to go to Wall Street amongst them. I see the opposite. Second, I see a disdain amongst them for people who are motivated. Not just they don't want money, I see a disdain amongst them for people who do just want money.
The measure of that restoration lies in the extent to which we apply social values, more noble than mere monetary profit. Happiness lies not in the mere possession of money. It lies in the joy of achievement, in the thrill of creative effort. The joy, the moral stimulation of work no longer must be forgotten in the mad chase of evanescent profit.
Whatever the propaganda, at the beginning of the 21st century, central banks' unregulated cheap money pumped up land values, which created an unsustainable asset bubble in a world that once again operates a rigged tax system that enriches entrenched privilege. Neoclassical economics have ruined life for the bottom billions, tempted everyone into intergenerational conflict, and created massive suffering that has no limits. A predatory capitalist's truest enemy and humanity's greatest ally is the self-educated individual who has read, understood, delays their gratification, and walks around with their eyes wide open.
Our financial systems have been hijacked by a generation of thieves. While you're working harder and harder for less and less, the game is being rigged against you. They're turning all of us into virtual slaves. Looters, at the heart of our financial system, are price-fixing our most precious resources: food, water, energy, gold. They control the media using hot-button social issues to divide us, so we fight each other while they loot our sacred institutions. There is no need for austerity measures. There is no need for financial suffering. No need for poverty. The truth is, there is more than enough to go around. 60 years ago, productivity was increasing so fast, they predicted by today, entire families could live comfortably on the income of just one provider, working only 10 hours a week. They wondered what we'd do with all of our spare time. What happened to that dream? Turns out they were right. What took a full work week back then can be done in just 10 hours today. We have technologies that multiply our efforts 1,000-fold and connect us in ways they never imagined. We are now 100 times richer than in that great heyday of the 50s. We are heirs to a great bounty of prosperity. The only reason we don't experience this wealth is because it's being siphoned away. Let us replace their corrupt systems with better systems that benefit everyone. Let us reclaim the fruits of our productivity. Let us share our prosperity. We can do this. We have the power to create whatever future we want.